Welcome back. One of the things that you need to understand is Spring Web Services uses a contract first approach. So we have to define an XML and XSD and then define the configuration for Spring Web Services. And I understand that it's taking a little bit of time, but all this is definitely necessary before we would be able to execute our first request. This is, I think, one of our rare courses where we have passed more than 5 steps and still we have not really executed a request at all. The important thing is that we are following the right approach. So we have defined an XML, we have defined an XSD. Now we are defining the configuration for Spring Web Services, and then we would generate the WSDL. After we generate the WSDL, we would be ready to execute our request. So until then, have a little bit of patience. And in this step, we would try and expose a WSDL. One of the things that we have been talking all the while until now is we would want to create a WSDL using Spring Web Services. So Spring Web Services actually creates the WSDL for us. We will not create a WSDL by hand. We would want to call this WSDL as courses.wsdl, and we would want to expose this at a URL /ws/courses.wsdl. This web service definition is based on the schema, right? So we already created a schema. So we have a course details.xsd as the schema. So what we'll configure Spring Web Service to do is use the schema and generate this WSDL for us. And when we configure the WSDL, we will need to configure a couple of things. One of them is port type, something like an interface. We'll talk about ports a little later when we actually have a detailed discussion on WSDL. So that's the course port that you would need to define. And the other thing you would also need to define is the namespace, right? So namespace we already know. Namespace is the default one we keep using always. The namespace that we would want to configure is this. Port type that we would want to configure is course port. And this is the XSD based on which we would want the WSDL to be created. So let's start with defining the schema. The way we would define a schema is by defining another bean at bean. Okay, cool. And the way we would define a schema is by using XSD schema. So the return type is XSD schema, and I would want to create a method called courses schema. We can import the XSD schema in. As you can see, this is one of the things in Spring Framework XML XSD package. Now I would want to create a courses schema. So I would say return, one of the classes is simple XSD schema. We just want to create a simple XSD schema, class path resource, and I would need to give the path. So we already know that the course details.xsd is in source main resources. This is already in the class path. So I'll say course details.xsd. That's all we would need. Course details.xsd and return this back. So we have now defined the schema. Let's do a import simple XSD schema. Oops, I have to put a new in here. Okay, new simple XSD schema. That's cool. We have a schema defined. Now we will need to use this schema in our WSDL definition. Let's see how to do that. So we will define a bean, and the name of this bean we would want to have as the name of the WSDL. So the name of this bean we would want to have it as courses, and this bean here what we are defining is the WSDL definition. Okay, one of the things I forgot to do is make these public. So all of them, let's make them public. Okay, now I would actually say public, and next I would want to add in, what we want to do is to define a WSDL schema. We'll use something called default WSDL 11 definition. So we'll use that. We'll create a bean of that type and return it back, and I'll call this the same thing, default WSDL definition. This is the name of the method. One of the inputs that I would need to pass in, as we discussed earlier, is the courses schema. What Spring does is it creates an instance of this bean and auto wires it in here because we have put an add bean in here. So this becomes one of the dependencies. So it takes it and wires it in here. Now I would need to create an instance of the WSDL and return it. So let's say definition is equal to new default WSDL definition. Oops. Semicolon, return definition. Now we have the definition returned back in here, but there are a few things that we need to do before we are done. So I need to set a few values into the definition. One of them is I need to set a port type. Let's take this here, namespace. We need to set something called location URI. that's by setting the path. So I would need to give it this. So this is the location, because the courses is defined in here. We need to say /ws is the URL at which I would want to expose this. So that's cool. And also, last thing we would need to set is the schema. Even though we got schema as the input, we have not really set it in yet. So let's start doing it one by one. So we would want to start with the port type. Okay, definition dot set port type name, and we want to call this course port. When we look at WSDL in detail, you'll understand more about port type. It's like almost like an interface. You can think of it like an interface which defines different types which are present, and later we would see how the binding defines the implementation for it. So next I would want to create the namespace. So definition.set target namespace. What should it be? You already know that. It should be courses. Let's do that. We would also want to set the URI. Set location URI. It's /ws. That's basically what we have in here. That's also done now. Last thing I would want to set is the schema. Definition.set schema, and the schema is courses schema. Okay, that's all the configuration that we would need to be able to run our web service finally. So after a long set of setup, we started with creating an XML, XSD, then we started with creating an endpoint, then we created the configuration. First, we defined a servlet registration bean, basically mapping our message dispatcher servlet to the URL, and then we tried and exposed the WSDL definition based on our schema. These were all the steps that we had to take before we are ready to run our web service application. So let's go ahead and run it. The way we can run that SOAP course management application class. So it's right click, run as Java application. Okay, when I run this, I get an error. It says Java lang not found WSDL extensions extensibility element. This is because one of the things that we need to be able to define a WSDL is missing in the pom.xml. So if you want to create a WSDL, we need to make use of a jar. So Spring Web Services makes use of a specific implementation of the WSDL. So let's add that in. I'll copy the dependency. The group ID for that is WSDL for J. Simple, right? WSDL for J. It's the same artifact ID as well. You would see that that dependency would be imported in. Oh, that's cool. So now I can rerun the application again. So of course, management application. The application starts up. Tomcat started on port 8080, and we would see that a lot of other things are initialized. If you have trouble starting up the application or firing the request as it would be explained in the next step, you can use this guide as a way of finding what might be the problem. So the SOAP web services is what we are looking at right now. So if you go to the Git repository and click the link SOAP web services, you'd be going to a page where we would have the entire backup of whatever we are doing in this course. We are right now at the stage which is backed up using backup 05. So if you go to backup 05, this should contain exactly the code as you should have. So the first thing you can do if you have a problem is to try and compare what is in here with what you have. Try and take a look at what is present inside this backup 05 and see if it does not really match what you have. In the next step, we would configure a web services client and also try and invoke a sample request against the service. Until the next step, bye-bye.